Behind closed doors and in the silent corners of relationships, invisible strings pull at our hearts, strings laced with fear, confusion, and manipulation. What if everything you thought about love and loyalty has been skillfully twisted into a weapon? This book is not a simple communication guide. It is a ruthless excavation into the shadowy world of trauma bonding, where affection camouflages control and kindness can become a subtle trap. Are you ready to recognize the patterns no one talks about? Break free from the psychological chains and reclaim the life that always belonged to you. The answers you seek wait inside these pages. Cut the Strings, Mastering Freedom from Trauma Bonding, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1. Seeing the Invisible Chains. In the quiet comfort of her living room, the steady hum of an ordinary evening is interrupted when Claire's partner leans in with a gentle smile. He asks her, almost casually, why she insists on visiting her friends so often. Isn't spending time together what truly matters? Claire brushes it off, accepting his concern as affection, a testament to how much he values her presence. Offering a patient nod, he repeats how the outside world is filled with malicious people who do not understand their unique bond, explaining it is safer and better for both of them to keep their world small, just theirs. For weeks, small acts like these pile up. A subtle remark about her outfit, a question about a private phone call, careful observation of how much she spends, hushed reminders that no one else really cares for her but him. Claire starts withdrawing from social gatherings, slowly loses touch with old friends, and second-guesses herself whenever she wants something for her independence. What unfolds in Claire's everyday existence is subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye. There are no overt threats, no doors slammed, no visible bruises, and yet, without announcement, the atmosphere in her life starts to shift. The lightness in her laughter dims, her confidence falters, and she finds herself tiptoeing through the relationship, always weighing every word and action to keep the peace. She wonders if it's stress, if perhaps she's overreacting. She wishes to believe that loyalty is being confused with obligation and love with responsibility. But in these soft exchanges, something much darker quietly blooms. Unseen yet devastating, this is the handiwork of psychological manipulation. Its true danger is not simply in the act itself, but in its invisible nature, a game masterfully played by those whose goal is long-term control. The manipulator pursues ultimate objectives that strike far deeper than what appears on the surface. They plant doubts, create dependence, and mold perceptions, seeking not only to win arguments or direct behavior, but to weave complex webs of deep emotional control. The purposes vary. Sometimes it is to erode self-confidence, other times to financially exploit, to orchestrate social isolation, or simply to program unquestioning compliance. However, for the person being manipulated, recognition arrives late, if at all. Many victims like Claire are swept up by gradual changes that cloak themselves as care or protectiveness. The transformation builds so incrementally that lines between concern and control blur into gray. Day by day, the person loses a vital piece of themselves, another dream, a friend, the freedom to speak freely or make small personal choices. They rationalize these concessions because manipulative partners always dress their control in the language of love or loyalty. It is a perilous paradox, one where what initially appears as closeness is actually the tightening of invisible chains. And it is this very invisibility that fortifies the bonds of trauma and dependency, keeping victims trapped in plain sight, unable to see what's truly happening around them until escape feels almost impossible. The effects of psychological manipulation seep into the very core of a person's being, gradually distorting everything from emotional stability to the bedrock of personal identity. As emotional ties are weaponized, simple feelings of joy, safety, or love are carefully transmuted into persistent anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt. A manipulated individual is often left riding waves of uncertainty, alternating between brief moments of comfort and growing spells of emotional agony. Research in psychological abuse highlights that chronic manipulation undermines the brain's stress response, leaving victims hypersensitive to criticism, yet starved for validation. Decision-making becomes a minefield. Choices that once felt intuitive now invite dread, and second-guessing becomes a daily companion. The manipulator's alternating affection and withdrawal trigger a cycle of hope and fear so powerful that the manipulated person's sense of agency erodes, not in some dramatic instant, but in a series of small, invisible forfeitures. Relationships, once defined by trust and mutual respect, morph into a landscape of landmines and shifting allegiances. Ordinary disagreements spiral into crises, with the manipulator constantly moving the boundaries of what is acceptable and shrouding intentions in misleading language. Loyalty and love become tools to be wielded and bartered. A famous testimony from the confessions of survivors and support groups reveals how partners isolated them through subtle tactics. One woman recounted how her partner discouraged her friendships, insisting that her friends were bad influences, while another spoke of a partner who would ridicule her ambitions until she believed she was incapable of success on her own. In every story, the echo is the same: the gradual shrinking of the world around the victim, until the only voice left to trust is that of the manipulator. Self-esteem, the quiet foundation of self-worth, faces the most devastating onslaught. Numerous controlled studies on emotional abuse assert that survivors often cite a persistent inability to trust their own perceptions after enduring manipulative tactics. Compliments are spoon-fed only after demonstrations of obedience, reinforcing the illusion that love must be earned and perfection must be maintained to deserve kindness. Over time, the victim begins to see themselves through the distorted lens crafted by the manipulator: flawed, needy, and dependent. The shift from internal confidence to self-doubt is so gradual that by the time the manipulated person starts to lose themselves, the memory of their former strength becomes almost unreachable. Why, though, do people fall for such insidious entanglements? The answer lies partially in humanity's innate desire for connection and belonging. Manipulators are adept at reading individual vulnerabilities and mirroring the values or dreams of their targets, convincing their victims that they have finally found understanding and unconditional acceptance. A well-known psychological study on coercive control describes the honeymoon phase, in which an abuser showers their target with attention, praise, and physical affection, only to abruptly withdraw their approval as a form of punishment. Incentivized by the craving to return to that warmth, the victim becomes locked in a loop, constantly striving to please and win back the affection that has been strategically withheld. This dynamic is what makes manipulation so persistent and powerful. It weaves itself into the fabric of everyday life until what once appeared benign becomes impossible to separate from harm. This relentless reshaping of emotions, relationships, and self-beliefs is not merely the stuff of rare, tragic stories. It is a silent epidemic, thriving on its ability to remain disguised. Now that the emotional stranglehold has been revealed, the next part will uncover the subtle warning signs that most people miss, and how to bring these insidious patterns into the light at last. Manipulators are calculated in their approach, employing a ruthless precision when selecting their targets. Contrary to popular belief, they do not always seek out the weak or the obviously vulnerable. Instead, they are keen observers, attuned to those whose boundaries are permeable, whose desire for acceptance runs deep, and whose histories may quietly broadcast a longing for validation. Whether through a fleeting conversation at a social event or a slow, careful observation over time, the manipulator tests responses, picking up on unmet emotional needs, hesitations in asserting oneself, or a tendency toward forgiveness and empathy. They learn where the soft spots lie long before their intentions fully unfold, using these insights as the handbook for psychological access. Consider the case of Eric, an ambitious professional new to a demanding team. His manager, noticing Eric's eagerness to prove himself and win approval, gradually widens the boundaries of acceptable requests, first by giving extra assignments under the guise of trust, then subtly criticizing Eric's abilities while publicly praising others. Over weeks, Eric works longer hours, forgoing personal obligations in the pursuit of affirmation he hopes will finally come. Yet it is always artwork just out of reach, and Eric only later recognizes how his growing anxiety and perfectionism are not failures of character, but symptoms of expertly manipulated dependency. In another context, imagine Rosa, who reconnects online with an old friend after moving to a new city. Rosa reveals her feelings of loneliness and the struggle of starting over. Her friend, sensing opportunity, quickly fills the space in Rosa's daily life, offering support and understanding. As months pass, the friend begins to critique Rosa's appearance, choices, and other relationships, couching every jab as looking out for her. The longer this continues, the more Rosa transforms from an independent newcomer into someone who hesitates to make any decisions without the friend's pre-approval, her world slowly shrinking until it revolves around a single influence. Patterns emerge with unmistakable clarity in these cases. Mere friendliness escalates to intrusive familiarity, empathy gives way to subtle judgments, and moments of support serve as setups for dependence. The psychological shift rarely happens suddenly. Instead, it often begins with an uncomfortable feeling easily dismissed as overcautious, such as an uneasiness toward a seemingly harmless question, or a reluctance to share good news out of fear it will be met with disdain instead of celebration. Over time, those feelings compound, and a new set of internal rules, what to say, how to behave, who is safe, takes root, all designed not for self-preservation, but to avoid the manipulator's withdrawal of approval or escalation of disapproval. This process of systematic targeting and slow indoctrination is the core weapon of psychological manipulation. Only by closely analyzing these everyday interactions can someone begin to distinguish genuine intimacy from an orchestrated illusion. Grasping these patterns is not an act of pessimism, but one of urgent self-defense. It is the foundation upon which true emotional freedom is built, for once awareness is sharpened, resistance becomes possible. With this critical understanding secured, the next step is to recognize how the manipulator's tactics escalate, ensnaring victims in cycles that are increasingly difficult to break. Chapter 2. Naming the Toxic Patterns. The clock flashes midnight as Thomas sits at the family dinner table, paperwork stacked high, tension knotting his shoulders. His partner Julia quietly sips tea across from him, her conversation floating between gentle encouragement and subtle warnings about their finances. She repeatedly reminds him that their future depends on his diligence, that if he truly cares for their stability, nothing else should matter. Not his friends' calls, not his hobbies, and certainly not time for himself. With each reassurance, Julia expresses disappointment in his lingering doubt or fatigue, softly insisting that her worries for him are justified, and that anyone who questions her motives does not understand what's best for us. The weight of responsibility presses so persistently that Thomas ceases to wonder when his own priorities last took precedence. He grows so enveloped in her narrative that he internalizes a constant sense of guilt whenever he contemplates stepping away from her demands. What's unfolding before Thomas is no mere partner's concern. It's the systematic, quiet construction of a toxic pattern. Julia's manipulation veils itself in concern, masking attempts to dominate Thomas's time and minds. She positions herself as the main architect of household security, painting a picture where all discomfort warrants further surrender of control, while disagreements become evidence of disloyalty or ingratitude. Ever so subtly, the lines blur between reasonable compromise and routine emotional coercion. Thomas cannot name exactly when he stopped choosing his own path, but he now finds movement almost impossible without Julia's approval. Each lost opportunity, each silenced dream, slips away with every agreement to prioritize her vision, and soon the pattern repeats: reassurance, control, and guilt. This is what makes toxic patterns so dangerous. They rarely announce themselves. Instead, the manipulator's goal often develops not only into emotional control, but also into channeling resources, orchestrating isolation, and extracting unquestioned compliance. Toxicity arises through tiny, near-innocuous exchanges, so discreetly woven into daily life that they solidify into invisible routines. With every repeated cycle of misdirection and self-blame, a finely tuned mechanism forms where the victim's sense of freedom steadily narrows. Thomas never notices the shape of the trap until the doors close behind him. Patterns like these are sustained by a clever interplay of fear and longing. On one side lies the dread of disappointing the manipulator, of being made to feel responsible for their anxieties and fears. On the other side stands a hope, albeit increasingly desperate, that meeting the manipulator's needs will eventually restore peace, or earn genuine affection. This duality keeps the victim locked in a relentless loop, searching in vain for the one perfect compromise that will make the relationship safe again. In reality, however, such safety is always conditional, always just beyond reach, and always owned by the one holding the strings. To finally understand the mechanisms at work is not only difficult, but also painful. This is the step so easily missed: the recognition of a repeating pattern, not an isolated conflict. It is the deep, unsettling truth beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for a name and daring to be revealed. The corrosive impact of toxic patterns extends far beyond the visible struggles between victims and manipulators. At their core, these cycles deliver a silent but devastating assault on the person's emotional equilibrium. Victims experience gradual shifts in their internal landscape. What starts as a wish to preserve harmony or show love devolves into a constant undertone of anxiety and self-doubt. It is not simply the manipulator's needs or demands that dominate. It is the haunting suspicion in the victim's own mind that any displeasure or difficulty in the relationship is entirely their fault. Psychological studies consistently reveal that targets of coercive control and manipulation show elevated levels of stress hormones, diminished trust in their own judgment, and even symptoms akin to post-traumatic stress disorder. The heart becomes wary, ever attuned to danger that may never be openly declared. These patterns erode the decision-making process itself. Victims, uncertain where the line lies between accommodation and self-sacrifice, begin to suspend their own preferences and instincts. They repeatedly second-guess their impulses, hesitating before making even simple choices, and running every possibility through the filter of the manipulator's anticipated reaction. A landmark research study on emotional abuse, led by Dr. Evan Stark, described the way victims report walking on eggshells in every facet of life, perpetually attempting to avoid setting off the next round of criticism or cold withdrawal. Everyday acts, answering a phone call, spending a small amount of money, sharing news, become possible triggers for further control or guilt, until the victim's autonomy is reduced to managing the manipulator's moods at the expense of their own independence. Relationships are quietly, almost imperceptibly, redefined around these toxic patterns. The facade of closeness hides an uneven balance, where affection is conditional and boundaries are systematically eroded. Genuine intimacy is replaced by a constant feedback loop. Approval is given as a reward for compliance, then withdrawn as a punishment for disobedience. In a widely cited survivor account, Lisa, an articulate, ambitious woman, described losing her social ties and career aspirations as her partner distanced her from friends, hijacked conversations, and reinterpreted every conflict as evidence she cared too little for him. What she experienced, she realized in retrospect, was not rare friction, but a wielding of her fears and needs to accomplish his desire for dominance over every aspect of her life. Self-esteem is the ultimate casualty in this environment. Day by day, the victim's sense of worth is hollowed out. Affirmation from the manipulator becomes the only source of emotional safety, and with it, the illusion that restoration is just one more sacrifice away. Over months and years, people internalize the narrative that their feelings, dreams, and dignity are expendable. Carol Dweck's research into mindsets adds clarity here, showing that repeated exposure to negative authority-driven interpretation of one's behavior embeds a sense of unworthiness, undermining all future confidence and agency. Why do smart, loving, resourceful people continue to fall into such elaborate traps? The hook lies in the blend of manipulation and the basic human yearning for closeness and approval. Manipulators expertly toggle back and forth between affection and control, rewriting the victim's understanding of what is normal. Psychological attachment theory proves that intermittent validation, the reward randomly scattered inside a web of emotional punishment, is the most powerful form of conditioning. The victim keeps searching for a time when compromises will finally yield unconditional acceptance, not realizing each cycle binds them tighter to the pattern. Recognizing that these toxic dynamics corrode not just happiness but the very ability to choose freely becomes a call to break the silence. The next part will reveal the subtle warning signs, those overlooked details that offer the first true key to recognizing and ultimately escaping harmful control. Manipulators display a chilling accuracy when it comes to identifying their targets, as if they possess a sixth sense for human vulnerability. In reality, they are talented social strategists who collect subtle cues from potential victims, whether it's a momentary hesitance to speak up, an eagerness to please, or past wounds that still surface in present conversation. They tend to gravitate toward those with open hearts, high empathy, or a strong desire for approval, quietly assessing which boundaries can be nudged or crossed without immediate challenge. This is rarely a conscious or transparent process. Instead, manipulators often tell themselves they are merely helping or protecting someone, while methodically shaping circumstances in their favor. Consider a workplace environment in which a seasoned team leader, Mark, recognizes that one of his subordinates, Mia, appears anxious to prove that she can be trusted with extra responsibility. At first, Mark offers guidance and encouragement, strategically complementing her commitment. Over time, though, these compliments become infrequent, while demands on Mia's time and emotional energy escalate. Tasks are piled one after another, and moments of recognition are only provided if Mia goes above and beyond, all under the guise of professional development. Mia finds that her boundaries blur. She works late hours not just to excel, but to avoid his subtle disappointment or cool detachment. Little by little, any feedback Mark gives her, critical, ambiguous, or even dismissive, transforms into the most important standard by which she judges her identity as an employee. The result is not only exploitation, but a quiet remapping of her entire self-concept. Alternatively, look at the story of Charlotte, who after a hard breakup finds herself drawn to a new online friend. Initially, this friend is all support and gentle concern. However, the conversation grows more intrusive. Charlotte is asked repeatedly about personal struggles, dreams, and regrets. The friend, noticing Charlotte's struggle to say no or assert herself, starts to steer her away from seeing other friends and suggests that only their connection is honest and meaningful. This calculated singling out is an act of predation. Over weeks, Charlotte starts to believe that her value is in her availability to this one person. The isolation creeps in, installed one layer at a time by someone who recognized her need for affirmation as a gateway to deeper influence. Subtle psychological shifts mark these campaigns. Victims begin to prioritize the manipulator's opinions, gradually discounting their own needs or reality. Internal narratives change, self-doubt intensifies, rationalizations multiply, boundaries soften, and ultimately vanish. The manipulated person begins anticipating criticisms, filtering memories, and even blaming themselves for the manipulator's unhappiness. Everyday decisions begin and end with the question, what will they think? When did I begin to care this much about their moods and critiques? Understanding the intricacies of how targets are identified and conditioned is a foundational act of self-defense. When one can spot the earned rapport, the incremental increase in demands, and the erosion of boundaries, the haze begins to clear. To name these toxic patterns is to take the first true step toward freedom and resistance. In the next part, the focus shifts to how control escalates and why so many victims find themselves mired in perpetual cycles, preparing you to recognize those moments before the chains tighten further. Chapter 3. Reclaiming Inner Power. Beneath the warmth of family holidays, hidden from even the closest relatives, Veronica watches the evening unfold with her heart clenched in silence. Her brother Anthony's kind words for their mother or laughter with cousins sound genuine to anyone listening, but she feels the constraint of living according to his silent rules. These rules are never written down, only understood through years of careful compliance and wordless consequences. When Veronica asserts her opinion or expresses excitement for an opportunity her brother dislikes, conversation at the table shifts, his eyes grow pointed and cool, and she feels the unspoken threat of disapproval. After dinner, Anthony gently reminds her that she is overreacting and being ungrateful, always implying that his ideas are responsible for any happiness she enjoys. Yet when Veronica takes independent steps, whether that be planning a trip without the family's blessing or pursuing her own interests, she is either met with stonewalling or oddly orchestrated family concern for her well-being, each subtle challenge causing her to retract. In this twilight between spoken promise and veiled threat, the manipulator's goal is emotional domination achieved through soft dissent, guilt, and the theft of self-trust. It is a careful recalibration of reality in which the victim, without external violence, becomes their own jailer. No voice is ever raised, no order given outright. Instead, a slow corrosion of autonomy weaves into the smallest details, until one day Veronica is startled at how much her decisions are predicated on anticipated reactions instead of her genuine desires. She is not asked to deny herself with explicit force or demand, but taught to reinterpret her priorities as difficult or even burdensome to the family. The web is cleverly spun. Each gesture of love or concern is calculated to cement mutual dependency while ensuring all roads circle back to the manipulator's wishes. Those closest to Veronica, unable to sense the change, see only a caring family member who seems a little more reserved than usual. It is this invisibility that sustains the cycle. Emotional control is achieved through careful distortion of facts, the rewriting of family events, and calibrated language that assigns blame or virtue with every passing moment. Onlookers see a mild exchange. Only Veronica can sense the subtle script. Over time, reflexive apologies and automatic self-monitoring anchor her within these invisible walls, even as her achievements and personal milestones shrink. In this way, the boundary between self-sacrifice and erasure of the self grows faint. She loses the ability to separate authentic self-care from the impulse simply to survive the manipulator's silent scrutiny. The tragedy and the mystery of Veronica's story is not just how thoroughly the cycle is maintained, but how late she realizes she is living according to another's script. Each individual act feels small, each loss of voice justified away, yet collectively these moments accumulate into a profound surrender. The underlying truth, rarely spoken yet deeply felt, is the loss not of overt freedoms, but of the very ability to define freedom for herself. This is the turning point where reclaiming inner power is no longer a distant hope, but a matter of survival. Though for most, the realization arrives only when so much time, peace, and self-confidence have been methodically drained away. The consequences of having one's autonomy slowly eroded by psychological manipulation penetrate much deeper than surface discomfort. Emotionally, victims often experience a chronic sense of anxiety and guilt, as if every decision requires the manipulator's silent approval even when they are physically absent. This presence haunts thoughts and choices, creating a phantom audience that never fully disappears. The tension grows with every moment of hesitation, as the manipulated person internalizes not just the fear of disappointing the manipulator, but also the sabotaging inner voice that insists their own preferences are somehow selfish or reckless. Researchers at the University of Michigan discovered a tangible, persistent hyperarousal in those subjected to sustained emotional control, leading to sleeplessness, irritability, and a subtle withdrawal from previously joyful activities. Decision-making suffers sharp blows under this pressure. Rather than seeking what is right or satisfying for themselves, targets of manipulation learn to curate their lives around avoiding potential conflict or disapproval. Every minor choice is filtered through complex calculations. What outcome will least upset the manipulator? Which words or actions might prevent the next cold shoulder or guilt-inducing remark? Over time, this constant recalibration fragments one's clarity and self-assurance. Dr. Jennifer Fried's betrayal trauma research highlights how the perpetual need to minimize disruption for a controlling figure leads victims to distort or even suppress their memories. They become unreliable narrators of their own lives, unable to fully trust what they feel or recall, creating fertile ground for confusion and a deep void where confidence once resided. Relationships are deeply infected by this hidden campaign. Friends and other loved ones notice personality shifts, subtle retreats, or growing reluctance to make plans without checking with the controlling person. Eventually, the pattern seeps beyond the original relationship, warping all other connections and eroding the natural social trust that is essential for well-being. Survivors often report that even after leaving the manipulative environment, they unconsciously search for cues to signal how much of themselves is safe or permissible to reveal. This reticence isolates and deprives them of external support, compounding the feeling that even small steps toward independence are dangerous or selfish. Self-esteem, meanwhile, is perhaps the most enduring casualty. Real-life stories mirror this reality across countless backgrounds and cultures. In one prominent case, a college student named Jordan described in counseling sessions how gentle but unrelenting critiques from his elder sibling about his maturity, social skills, and life direction transformed him from a confident, ambitious young man into someone afraid to voice ideas in group projects or take on challenges. The compliments, now rare, became more precious to Jordan than any external achievement, cementing the manipulator as both the cause of and solution to his insecurity. These cycles are reinforced by the brain's wiring: intermittent reward, punctuated by withdrawal conditions, deeper dependence than constant kindness ever could, as shown by classic behavioral psychology experiments. Ultimately, people fall for these invisible chains because emotional manipulation draws from the well of innate human yearning to belong, to be approved of, to be part of something meaningful. Manipulators position themselves as essential providers of safety or identity, which makes marginal betrayals feel like personal failures instead of calculated acts of dominance. The sense of urgency to reclaim inner power intensifies with every realization that these changes are not natural or deserved. Recognizing the covert tactics and subtle signals is vital, for the next part will uncover the overlooked signs, the early warnings, that many dismiss, yet mark the beginning of a much larger loss. Manipulators possess a refined instinct for recognizing those most likely to fall under their sway. They often focus on individuals who show generosity, empathy, or the inclination to put others' needs first. Subtle cues, gestures of reassurance, apologetic behavior, or consistent patterns of self-sacrifice signal to the manipulator which boundaries can be breached and when. These individuals, because of their warmth or idealism, may have a history of relationships where their voices were not centered, or they may have endured traumas that left their self-trust fragile. The manipulator's insight is not born out of compassion, but out of an almost predatory tendency to observe, probe, and adapt. Over casual conversations and daily interactions, manipulators test for vulnerabilities, pushing gently at first, then, as they grow bolder, exploiting the smallest cracks. This can be seen in the case of David, who, after starting a new job at a nonprofit, stands out for his reliability and readiness to help where needed. His supervisor, Laura, takes notice initially through praise and inclusion in decision-making. Soon she increases her demands for his time, but frames each new responsibility as proof that David alone is trustworthy. Whenever he hesitates or proposes alternative solutions, Laura's enthusiasm gives way to cool intimidation or veiled disappointment. She suggests that David's lack of complete agreement hints at disloyalty or a disregard for the mission. Gradually, David feels compelled to surrender more of his time and autonomy, not for the cause, but to receive the benefits of inclusion and escape the growing chill of disapproval. In another scenario, Leticia's boyfriend compliments her independence and bright outlook in the early stages of their relationship. As the months pass, he shifts to making subtle jokes about her social circle, occasionally urging her to spend less time with friends for fear that she will be led astray. When Leticia expresses discomfort, the boyfriend guilt-trips her, suggesting that her concerns reveal she does not believe in their relationship. Bit by bit, Leticia retreats, reasoning that maintaining peace is more important than defending her boundaries. In both these cases, the manipulator's approach is never forceful, but instead is masked as concern, teamwork, or affection. The internal transformation in individuals like David and Leticia begins with rationalizations. They convince themselves that external approval is validation, and small compromises are natural sacrifices in healthy relationships. Over time, however, these compromises multiply. Self-doubt is planted and carefully watered by the manipulator's selective encouragement and disappointment. Anxiety sprouts not just about voicing needs or disagreeing, but even about forming personal goals that have not first received external blessing. This psychological shift can be so subtle that many do not realize independence has faded until it is almost fully erased. Recognizing these patterns is not a matter of pessimism, but of survival and self-defense. Anyone can fall into the web of manipulation if they are denied tools to decipher intention and boundary. Knowledge of these intricate dynamics must come before action. Only then does resistance become more than wishful thinking. By mastering the art of identification, both of toxic behaviors and of one's own worth, an essential layer of self-protection is forged. The next section will delve into how manipulators escalate their tactics, trapping victims in deeper and more destructive cycles, offering you insight to intercept the process before true autonomy is lost. Chapter 4. Breaking the Emotional Hook. In the dim glow of their shared apartment, Alicia quietly closes her laptop, her eyes blurring as her partner Greg scrolls through her social messages on his phone. It started innocently months ago, a harmless curiosity about a new coworker who texted her late. But where curiosity ended, interrogation grew. Each evening, Greg invents new reasons why Alicia's loyalty should be proven, why she should answer for every contact, every message, every interaction not directly focused on him. If she hesitates or expresses discomfort, he draws out chilling stories of betrayal from his past, making her feel responsible for mending wounds she didn't inflict. This is not the anger of an insecure man. It is the calculated tightening of an emotional leash, forged link by link with guilt and unease. The manipulation is woven discreetly into the margins of daily life. Greg cloaks his mistrust in wounded charm or teary confessions, suggesting Alicia is the one thing protecting him from his old heartbreak. If Alicia tries to set boundaries, the resistance is almost theatrical. Greg collapses in hurt silence, his mood shifting until the apartment is heavy with unspoken blame. Nights that once promised peace now echo with Alicia's anxious thoughts. She believes with growing conviction that Greg's contentment and their entire relationship rests on her ability to navigate these delicate emotional landmines. For Greg, emotional control is the objective. He does not strive for open warfare or explosive argument, but for compliance dressed in the clothing of intimacy. Each test of Alicia's boundaries answers the same question. Will she silence her instincts and needs? Will she choose his comfort over her dignity? And crucially, will she keep mending a wound that never truly heals? The emotional hook is calibrated perfectly. Should Alicia reassure him, her world contracts further. Should she resist, the threat of losing him grows. Desiring peace, she finds herself whittling down the borders of her life, unconsciously prioritizing his happiness above her own well-being. Friends outside their walls might see a couple who just needs better communication. What they cannot see is how gradually Alicia has come to fear her partner's disappointment more than her own unhappiness. How she tiptoes through conversations, how her cheerful defiance has faded to careful compliance. She puzzles over why she is exhausted after a day spent only managing emotions, why her laughter feels rehearsed, why reaching out for advice seems like a betrayal rather than protection. She does not recognize how expertly Greg has ensnared her in a pattern she did not consent to, one that demands ever deeper self-sacrifice to fend off imagined catastrophes. By the time Alicia begins to notice the ghost of her own former self, the emotional hook has already become a chain. Each concession, each apology, and each effort to fix what she never broke tightens the invisible grip. Alicia's instincts for truth and autonomy are not shattered in a single day, but worn down grain by grain, until the prison doors close silently and hope itself feels too costly to claim out loud. The gradual tightening of the emotional hook leaves marks deep beneath the surface, reshaping every aspect of a victim's interior world. Those who are caught in patterns of psychological manipulation rarely recognize the full extent of the impact until the process is nearly complete. Emotionally, individuals like Alicia experience unshakable anxiety and persistent guilt. Their happiness becomes contingent not on healthy, mutual connection, but on the dampening of their own instincts to ensure the manipulator's comfort. The result is a slow-growing internal dissonance, a silent tension that colors every exchange and leaves the victim scanning for cues, second-guessing intentions, and walking a maze of invisible traps designed to reinforce the manipulator's sense of importance and centrality. The daily process of making decisions corrodes under the weight of manufactured obligation. Small choices, what to wear, whom to call, which messages to reply to, must all be carefully vetted through the manipulator's anticipated reaction. Decisions no longer arise from self-trust or preference, but from a tangled calculation. Which path will most efficiently limit negative emotional fallout? In psychological terms, this distortion is a textbook case of learned helplessness, as identified by Martin Seligman's studies. After repeated experiences of having their agency undermined, victims become paralyzed, waiting for cues before taking any initiative. Over time, the external voice of the manipulator becomes louder in their head than their own intuition, leading them to doubt even the smallest impulses toward their authenticity. Relationships deteriorate under the unspoken weight of one-sided emotional labor. What was intended as give and take morphs into a resigned caretaker dynamic. The victim is forever tending to the manipulator's wounds, performing a careful dance to steady their partner's unpredictable emotions, often at the cost of silencing their own. This process isolates them from trusted confidants and distorts their ability to recognize what healthy involvement actually feels like. Support networks gradually erode as the manipulator either drives wedges between the victim and friends or conditions the victim to feel guilty about seeking solace elsewhere. Such dynamics were heartbreakingly evident for Alicia. In therapy sessions, she recounted how Greg's repeated doubts and moodiness turned once supportive friendships into distant memories, her sense of self atrophying through each abandoned connection. Self-esteem is the casualty most keenly felt yet hardest to articulate. Manipulators manage the delicate balance of blame and reward, doling out validation only when the victim contorts themselves to meet impossible emotional standards, then withdrawing it to reinforce how essential they are in the victim's life. Studies conducted by Dr. Sandra L. Bloom illustrate how these cycles not only heighten stress and despair, but also degrade the mind's confidence in its own interpretation of reality. The victim adapts by rationing their truth, choosing quiet over confrontation, until the authentic self is paved over by the constant compulsion to appease another. Why does this emotional hook, once set, prove so hard to break? Because attachment runs deeper than logic, and the manipulator's strategy is to create an atmosphere where hope and fear are interwoven. Victims return again and again to earlier, loving moments, convincing themselves that harmony can be restored if they only try harder. The brain, seeking meaning, makes excuses for each new transgression, trusting in a narrative built on both longing and dread. There is an urgent need to understand these realities, as recognizing the mechanics of entrapment is the first step toward breaking the emotional hook. The next section will guide you in identifying the subtle, pervasive warning signs so often ignored until the cost has become almost unbearable. Manipulators are astute and deliberate in selecting whom they attempt to hook emotionally. They gravitate toward those whose boundaries can be softened, whose kindness outpaces their skepticism, and especially toward people with unmet emotional needs or fractured self-confidence. In social contexts, manipulators will often seek out individuals who seem eager for approval or longing for connection. They watch for gestures such as over-apologizing, a tendency to explain one's feelings in great detail, or quickness to soothe others in group settings. These signals are read as signs of pliability, a willingness to adjust or adapt in response to external emotion. Consider the case of Hannah, a young woman known among her peers for keeping peace at all costs. At work, her manager Todd leans on her flexibility and praises her willingness to rearrange her schedule for the team's benefit. As months pass, Todd's requests for favors steadily become demands, often accompanied by reminders of how much the team relies on Hannah's special touch to solve conflicts. On evenings when Hannah expresses reluctance or simply wants a day for herself, Todd's mood darkens and he quietly excludes her from conversations and decision-making. The exclusion stings, delivering a clear message that standing up for her own boundaries will cost her the acceptance and belonging she quietly craves. Todd has correctly identified Hannah's gentle nature and fear of confrontation, then expertly tailored his behavior to reward compliance and punish resistance. Similar tactics emerge in friendships or intimate relationships. Jamal, recovering from a turbulent breakup, becomes close with a new partner, Leela, who early on listens to his stories with sympathy and devotion. Over time, Lila uses his disclosures against him, raining guilt when he seeks consolation elsewhere or takes time away for self-care. She positions herself as the exclusive source of support, subtly discrediting Jamal's friends and family as untrustworthy or dismissive. The pattern is insidious. Jamal's inner life, carved smaller and smaller, becomes increasingly defined by how well he can handle Leela's ever-shifting emotions. The psychological shift is not explosive but persistent. Each act of doubt, guilt, or loneliness further ensnares him. These scenarios illustrate the way manipulators test emotional hooks. They escalate their awareness from casual observations to active manipulation, inserting themselves as the necessary solution to problems they simultaneously exaggerate or invent. Victims unwittingly become reliant on the approval, validation, or reassurance the manipulator provides, all while losing sight of their own previously established values and limits. This dependency feeds a quiet but corrosive cycle in the victim, a cycle in which comfort always comes from external authorization and the avoidance of conflict becomes more urgent than authentic self-expression. Controllers depend on this gradual mental shift to keep their targets close. The moment the pursuit of peace or affection consistently outweighs the drive for personal truth and healthy negotiation, the emotional hook deepens its grip. Disguised as care, these tactics demand not just obedience but emotional caretaking, solidifying the manipulator's centrality in the victim's sense of worth and security. Recognizing the framework behind these manipulations is not merely for intellectual understanding. It is decisively practical and necessary for self-protection. To understand who is likely to become a target, and how that targeting takes subtle yet effective roots, is to arm oneself with the beginnings of resistance. The chapter that follows will explore how these mechanisms escalate yet further, ensnaring targets in unbreakable cycles, unless those cycles are seen, named, and actively disrupted. Chapter 5. Rewiring for Real Love. In a modest but tidy apartment, Miles stands at a crossroads most people never see until they are far beyond it. Across from him at the breakfast table, Eva smiles gently, relational rituals unfolding with deceptive ease. The texture of their days is familiar, birthday reminders, shared grocery lists, playful glances, yet beneath the reassuring surface, a different narrative powers their togetherness. Eva has long since begun sculpting the world around her needs and insecurities. She threads her anxieties through every decision, inch by inch, redrawing which friends are welcomed, which jokes are tolerable, which dreams Miles is encouraged to chase, and which are subtly folded away. The dynamic does not hinge on arguments or loud discord. Instead, Miles finds himself gradually funneling his life to fit Eva's moods and preferences, swept along by flattery, gentle lament, or strategic vulnerability. When Miles mentions a business trip that excites him, Eva nurtures her disappointment quietly, offering half-spoken worries about their time apart and exaggerated reminders of past partners who left people they loved behind for work. He notices almost imperceptibly that he curtails his own ambitions before speaking, shaping even his smallest decisions around Eva's comfort. Compliments are delivered with a hidden edge. "You're so impressive. But I just wish your work didn't have to take you away from me so much." Each positive quality in Miles becomes the foundation for an invisible boundary he is not meant to cross. This scenario exposes the manipulator's true objective, a rare, tightly held form of emotional control dressed in affection and the language of devotion. Eva, whether consciously or not, orchestrates a version of love that becomes about Miles serving her feelings, tending her loneliness, aligning his progress with her sense of stability. True partnership is swapped for calculated compliance. Miles, like so many drawn into the gravity of manipulative love, cannot pinpoint a single moment when this pattern began. Instead, he constantly adjusts, each accommodation seeming harmless, each revised plan justified as another layer of care. Real intimacy dissolves into the preservation of peace at any price. Friends, if they notice at all, see only the absence of conflict. Miles seems unusually agreeable, remarkably steady, and quick to defend Eva's sensitivity. Even in moments of solitude, Miles argues with himself, wanting to break from the pattern but haunted by guilt, unsure if the peace he sustains is healthy or just a form of weariness. The hardest thing to notice, and the harder thing still to speak, is that love built on adaptation and hidden negotiation is love that cannot breathe. When the person you care for holds a silent veto over your aspirations and friendships, what remains is not a bond but a kind of velvet cage, expertly locked against any idea of independence. By the time the truth rises, the fact that Miles has exchanged real reciprocity for the mirage of harmony, he has already surrendered large portions of who he once wanted to be. The realization is not sudden, it dawns painfully in hindsight, arriving just as he is forced to wonder where the roots of real love might have been, and if it's possible to unlearn what the manipulation required him to believe. When the script of love becomes one of constant compromise and subtle control, the psychological consequences stretch far beyond surface frustration. Emotionally, individuals like Miles experience a growing sense of confusion and sadness that lingers long after individual disagreements have faded. What once felt like tenderness now carries the familiar undertow of unease. Every positive gesture is paid for by a complex feeling of indebtedness. Miles's ability to distinguish between genuine affection and manipulative caretaking erodes, until his responses are governed more by fear of causing sorrow or anxiety in Eva than by his own hopes or values. The once simple joys of independence are quietly replaced by a new reflex, measuring each move against the risk of disturbing Eva or evoking her disappointment. Researchers have identified this dynamic as a kind of chronic emotional labor, a vigilance so pervasive that the victim is never really off duty. The impact on decision-making is subtle but deeply paralyzing. At first, Miles's choices become filtered through consideration for Eva's feelings, but over time, the process changes. He stops considering his own goals altogether, finding himself unable to make straightforward decisions about work, hobbies, or social invitations without feeling the anticipation of trouble ahead. Case studies from relationship counseling sessions reflect how this kind of covert control trains targets to anticipate conflict and sidestep their own autonomy rather than voice disagreement. In one well-documented account, a woman named Jamie recounted how her partner's subtle guilt-tripping led her to abandon a long-planned career move, convinced over months of careful suggestion that to pursue her ambition would be an act of betrayal. Human instincts for self-protection morph into a constant, exhausting task of keeping peace. As relationships bend further under the weight of this hidden dynamic, intimacy is the clearest casualty. The managed harmony comes at the expense of true closeness. Vulnerability, which should build bridges, is weaponized to secure greater compliance. According to attachment theory and research from Dr. Sue Johnson, the healthiest love is built on shared vulnerability and interdependence, not control. But manipulated individuals slowly learn to conceal their pains and suppress their needs, calculating instead how best to preserve the manipulator's delicate equilibrium. Over time, affection becomes transactional, and new connections, whether with friends, family, or colleagues, are devalued, dismissed, or subtly discouraged as threats to the manipulator's hold. Self-esteem, meanwhile, is systematically diminished. Compromises accumulate like hidden tax bills, each small surrender polishing the illusion that happiness hinges on perfection and self-erasure rather than authenticity and mutual respect. Miles's experience echoes that of many others. In support group sessions, he hears repeated confessions of former confidence crumbling into apology and doubt. The intermittent approval, interspersed with cool withdrawal or disappointment, wires the brain to chase validation instead of satisfaction. Scholars on emotional dependency caution that this cycle reshapes personal narratives completely. A person starts to believe their dreams and convictions are problematic, that flourishing is selfish, and that real love must be proven through self-sacrifice. Why do people continue falling into these traps? Because manipulation does not start as war. It begins as appeasement and grows stealthily, grafting itself onto normal patterns of compromise and empathy. Loving people conflate giving with caring, unable to discern when their loyalty crosses the line into self-betrayal. By the time they see the cost to their spirit, the hooks lie deep. The next part will shine a light on the earliest and most easily dismissed indicators, signaling the presence of manipulation before it steals the joy and possibility from love itself. Manipulators are precise in their approach, scanning personalities and relationships for subtle vulnerabilities and adaptive traits that signal a person may be shaped to fit their agenda. Rather than targeting blatant weakness, they identify those predisposed to empathy, those with a history of trying to mend or mediate, or anyone hungry for love and reluctant to risk conflict. It is often the most nurturing, considerate, and self-aware people who become ensnared, qualities that, when exploited, can be reframed by manipulators as a lack of resolve or an invitation to push boundaries. Sometimes, the manipulator quietly observes their target in social settings to gauge how they handle disagreement or how quickly they apologize even when not at fault. Over time, they home in, adapting their tactics to exploit each hesitancy and reinforce the expectation of compromise. This was the pattern in Adam's relationship with Priya, a dynamic once lit by mutual admiration and exchanged support. Early on, Priya would marvel at Adam's patience and his dedication to listening. Gradually, she recognized that Adam's attentiveness was matched by a certain passivity. He rarely asserted himself or maintained his preferences if Priya expressed any reluctance. Noting this, she began to dictate their shared plans with more certainty, choosing events, meals, or even deciding how their weekends would be spent, always under the claim that Adam cared most about her happiness. With each instance where Adam chose acquiescence over advocacy, Priya adjusted her behavior, growing bolder in her expectations, certain of his willingness to prioritize her comfort over his own. Adam's instincts, tuned for partnership, mutated into a pattern of constant self-doubt. He came to believe that harmony equaled saying yes, even if the cost was cumulative and isolating. The shifts that unfold in such situations are mercilessly subtle. The manipulated individual no longer recognizes daily life as something self-directed. Instead, every decision is filtered through the manipulator's potential reactions. In counseling, men and women describe feeling relieved when plans get canceled, simply because it means one less opportunity for error or disappointment. Genuine excitement, spontaneity, and dreams slowly atrophy, replaced by persistent monitoring of moods and predicting fallout. Manipulators reinforce this with carefully timed rewards, brief affection, a well-placed compliment, or sudden attention just when the victim tries to assert their needs. This intermittent approval for obedience wires a powerful dependency, as supported by psychological research into variable ratio reinforcement, making it far harder for targets to step away from the pattern after initial compliance. Other scenarios repeat the same logic. A friend who relies too heavily on emotional disclosure to exact continued loyalty, or a spouse who attaches deep disappointment to every deviation from their plans, both employ quiet metrics to shape their target's sense of safety and agency. Victims learn over time not simply to please the manipulator, but to map real love as a field of careful anticipation. The manipulator's needs become the silent logic that bends every other priority. A critical pillar of self-defense is the capacity to recognize these quiet invasions during their earliest stages. Knowledge of how targets are chosen and how incremental adaptations harden into unbreakable habits is essential for anyone seeking to name their reality and fight for an authentic reciprocal connection. True resistance starts with awareness before rebellion. It is with this depth of understanding that the foundation for lasting change is built. The next part of this chapter will detail how the escalation of control intensifies and the reasons so many remain ensnared for years in these cycles, offering hope and strategy for reclaiming one's autonomy before it quietly disappears. Chapter 6. Living Unbound and Free. On an ordinary Sunday morning, Mara stands at her small kitchen window, the sunlight warming her face as she watches a city waking up. It looks peaceful outside, but inside her apartment, the atmosphere feels shrunken and threadbare. Her phone rests on the counter, inert but heavy with expectation as she waits for Scott's daily check-in. She used to savor weekends to herself, exploring new parts of the city, reading in coffee shops, or calling friends back home. Those freedoms faded piece by piece, replaced by a routine built around the timings of Scott's calls and his gentle but increasingly insistent questions about her plans. Scott rarely raises his voice or complains outright. Instead, With a persistent softness, he lets Mara know that he gets anxious when she's out too long. If she leaves his texts unanswered for more than an hour, he frames it as a worry, reminding her that he just can't relax not knowing where she is or if she's all right. So Mara responds, often before she's even read the message, telling herself it's harmless, just a small thing to help someone she cares about. Over months, Mara's daily decisions shift. If she's out and about, she keeps an eye on the time and limits her adventures to places where she can answer a call without background noise. She sees less and less of her friends, feeling embarrassed by how closely she must track her movements. Invitations to after-work gatherings produce anxiety instead of excitement, forcing her to generate good reasons she can share with Scott for keeping her outings brief. The world narrows, but no single boundary is ever declared. The change never has a single moment of arrival. Instead, the life Mara built swells with compromises. Her goals, once bright blazes of possibility, grow faint, replaced by reminders that Scott's peace depends on her predictable patterns and immediate responses. Here, the manipulator's ultimate goal is compliance. Scott seeks neither overt power nor isolation maintained by threat. Rather, he creates an environment in which Mara's freedom is voluntarily relinquished for love. His fear and worry become the landscape she must traverse and adjust herself to, until the process becomes subconscious and automatic. The hidden danger of this compliance is in Mara's belief that she is choosing her actions, not under duress, but as extensions of responsibility, kindness, or partnerhood. Scott's demands are often unspoken, suggested through moods and questions rather than decrees. The full extent of Mara's entrapment is invisible, masked by her own good intentions and repeated rationalizations. It takes a peculiar clarity to see this type of control for what it is. Friends might see Mara as loyal or exceptionally accommodating. Scott's requests will seem at first glance to rise from affection or normal concern. But behind these gestures, ordinary in their address but relentless in frequency, waits a deeply rooted strategy. Shape life so meticulously and quietly that the target one day wakes up in a world built not of possibilities, but permissions. Only after many months, if Mara finally stands by the window and allows an honest reckoning, does she sense how thoroughly she exchanged her freedom for the fragile illusion of peace. The slow suffocation of freedom under the guise of compassion or anxiety leaves wounds that are difficult to recognize and even harder to heal. Emotionally, individuals like Mara begin to feel distant from their former selves. Where once they might have experienced lightness, spontaneity, or even a sense of adventure, the world now feels muted, blunted by anticipation of someone else's reactions. Each day becomes an exercise in emotional vigilance, constantly monitoring their own words, whereabouts, and responses for any potential disturbance they could bring to their partner's fragile tranquility. Over time, moments of contentment become rare and fleeting, hollowed out by a constant questioning of whether their choices are legitimate or self-indulgent. This relentless anticipation seeps into every act of decision-making. Decisions no longer originate from inner desire or logic. Instead, they are made with a mental checklist about their partner's comfort and approval. This twisting of intentions fundamentally erodes confidence in one's ability to choose. In the case of Mara, her plans become an elaborate chessboard of forecasts, calculating how long lunch with a coworker should last, rehearsing explanations for minor detours, and second-guessing her presence at social gatherings. Psychological research led by Dr. Shirley Glass on emotional barriers identifies that such patterns create profound doubt and guilt, leading people to preemptively censor their ambitions in order to keep the peace. Their minds begin to associate autonomy not with happiness or fulfillment, but with anxiety and disruption. The fallout in relationships goes beyond losing friends or isolating oneself. It redefines the very quality of intimacy. A manipulated person often mistakes the absence of open conflict for relational health, when in fact it is simply the result of self-censorship. In testimony after testimony, people describe how attempts to reclaim time or voice new desires are met with emotional appeals, disappointment, or worse, abrupt withdrawal of affection. In one case study, a woman named Lacey recounted that her husband's routines of gentle questioning, even when laced with affection, resulted in her stepping back from professional networking events and old friends, convinced that her absence would destabilize him. The manipulator's emotional hooks become the only compass by which the victim navigates human connection, blurring any sense of mutuality and making the relationship orbit entirely around regulation of the manipulator's states. Self-esteem inevitably becomes eroded not through direct insults or criticism, but through unstated norms of compliance. Gradually, individuals become afraid to follow their own instincts or recognize their achievements, and learn instead to celebrate their successful avoidance of dissent. This indirect diminishment becomes a core part of their identity, rewriting their self-worth around how well they manage emotional landmines. According to psychological studies about covert control tactics, such experience mimics some symptoms seen in institutional settings. Individuals display reduced assertiveness, doubt their intuition, and sometimes wrestle with a chronic internal tension even when there is no visible threat present. People fall for these situations because the chains rarely present as restraints. Instead, they look like devotion, attentiveness, or protection. The hope for harmony slowly usurps the drive for personal fulfillment. It is a powerfully seductive trap for those who define themselves by their willingness to care. Yet behind these sacrifices, a new, hidden danger forms. They may choose a life of permissions over a life for themselves, not realizing until it feels too late that quiet compliance is not the same as love or loyalty. To end this chapter is to confront the first, vital glimmers of warning and realize just how many subtle signs are brushed aside in the steady tide of lost independence. The coming section will reveal what those signs are, teaching you how to spot the patterns before your world has narrowed beyond easy return. Manipulators excel at picking out those individuals whose qualities and circumstances make them more amenable to gradual control. They tend to focus on people for whom cooperation, kindness, and guilt over unmet expectations are part of their core emotional landscape. Sometimes the manipulator meets their target at a point of vulnerability, a recent move, a breakup, a new job, or senses that the person is highly conscientious, eager to maintain harmony and please others. The ability to compromise, when unbalanced by strong internal boundaries, becomes less a virtue and more a map for the manipulator to reshape reality in their favor. One such dynamic can be seen in the situation of Rachel and her longtime friend Simon. After Rachel endured a painful divorce, her expanded emotional openness and need for connection were plain to those around her. Simon began by providing support and validation, but within months, each piece of advice from Simon became less about her growth and more about steering her behavior. When Rachel suggested rekindling an old hobby or making new friends, Simon would gently remind her of times she was disappointed or left out, implying the risks outweighed any potential joy. Over time, Rachel relied less on her own intuition and more on Simon's encouragement and reassurances. He seemed to intuitively know when she felt uncertain, always appearing to protect her from disappointment by presenting a case against small acts of independence. This process created in Rachel a growing reluctance to take personal risks, replacing hope with persistent hesitation. While on the surface their friendship looked caring, Simon's covert discouragement steadily shrank Rachel's life to a narrow recitation of routines he approved or helped orchestrate. Such patterns are also visible in workplace settings. Jeremy joined a tech company eager to contribute, brimming with ideas. His manager, Mara, praised this enthusiasm publicly, but soon channeled Jeremy's projects to those that most directly benefited the department, always justifying the assignments as best for the team. When Jeremy attempted to assert his vision, Mara would respond with statements such as, "I was worried you might feel stretched if you did more," or, "Let's not risk the group dynamic." His eagerness, which once marked him as promising, was methodically redirected into a commitment to group harmony at the cost of his own growth. A year into his position, Jeremy found himself struggling to recall when he last pitched a new idea with confidence. Instead, his thoughts swirled around how to avoid Mara's disappointment or silent rebuke, even on trivial matters. These real-world accounts show that manipulators don't rely on force, but on the incremental reshaping of the target's perception of safety and risk. A subtle rewiring occurs. Actions once chosen for fulfillment are reconsidered and usually abandoned in anticipation of the manipulator's reaction. Over time, mere compliance becomes the new portrait of self. Decisions, aspirations, and confidence all filtered through the gatekeeper of another's needs. This shifting of priorities leads the controlled individual to equate their worth with their ability to avoid conflict, disappointment, or negative emotion from their manipulator. What began as a caring relationship or collaborative environment slowly morphs into an emotionally administered cage. The capacity to spot these patterns is not just useful, it is life-saving. Understanding how targeting occurs and why certain forms of encouragement or concern spell danger to personal growth builds an internal compass for self-defense. It is only when these psychological shifts are grasped that resistance can start, an act not of conflict, but of returning choice, voice, and possibility to where they always belonged. The following part of this chapter will delve into how these invisible shackles are welded tighter and why so many find escape so painstaking, preparing you to recognize and disrupt the cycles before your freedom slips quietly away. In this journey through Cut the Strings Mastering Freedom from Trauma Bonding, we have laid bare the invisible tactics of psychological manipulation, how they are seeded into our lives, how they erode confidence and autonomy, and how gradually the bonds of trauma can entangle even the strongest among us. By learning to see the patterns, name the toxic dynamics, and reclaim our inner power, we gain the tools to recognize, resist, and ultimately free ourselves from emotional captivity. Thank you for investing your time and awareness in uncovering these crucial truths. If this content resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Stealth Psychology for more insights and support on your path to empowerment.